call the member for Goldstein.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker, and it's charming to see you there in the chair this afternoon. And it's a great privilege.
We'll get you everywhere.
It's a great privilege to be able to speak on this bill this afternoon on the importance of fuel security for the nation. Because, Deputy Speaker, when I speak to Goldstein residents, there are a number of issues that come up of concern to them. And one of them, critically, is how do we secure the Australian national interest, both in terms of strategic threats economically, strategic threats in a defence capacity, and making sure that we have the reserves we need as a country so that we can hedge our risk and be confident going into the future. And there are a lot of issues that come under those banners. People are concerned about environmental risk and what various challenges we face and how it could degrade the future of the country. We have people who are concerned about supply chains and the technologies that we're going to need for the future, and critically to make sure that we have access to the materials that we need as a nation to have a viable manufacturing sector and one that can be resilient and strong and support the Australian economy for jobs and our national security. And that was highlighted particularly at the start of last year in terms of access to certain types of materials, particularly PPE at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. But one of the issues that regularly gets raised with me by constituents is also one of fuel security. Now, it gets raised again on different sides of the ledger. It gets raised with me in terms of the fuel and the fuel dependence that this country has, traditionally on different types of petrochemicals, and what does it mean for the future of Australia economically and environmentally, of the need to diversify. And on those issues I have a lot of sympathy with the constituents who raise them, because I want to see a diversification of our energy sources, much more so than the science deniers on the other side of this chamber, who seem to be only obsessed with limiting supply down to a narrow scope. I'm a great believer in hedging risk and going with technology and where technology can take us. As I've said many times, Deputy Speaker, I believe the future is going to be awesome, but the question is whether you're prepared to embrace that technological innovation. And so I welcome the discussion that so many people have raised in areas of stationary energy, whether it's in hydroelectric power, whether it's in terms of things like gas, and of course critically renewables as part of the discussion, not just as energy outcome in themselves, but then what they can be done to build the transport fuels of the future, and particularly around the potential for renewables to be part of the solution to hydrogen power, because that won't just deal with some of the challenges we have in a stationary energy capacity, but if you want to look at the long-term future of things like transport energy, it's going to be dependent, at least in part, on hydrogen and its potential. And particularly if you want to look at the long-term risks of electric vehicles and some of the challenges we have around battery technology and recycling, as well as resource constraints around things like lithium and lithium-ion, we need fuels like hydrogen to be part of that future. But there are also concerns that people raise to me on a more traditional basis, which is around our fuel security, not just for domestic industry, but also for the fuels we're going to need for our national defence. And this is not an academic exercise. If you go and look at the greenhouse gas emissions profile of the Commonwealth, a lot of it is absorbed actually in the Defence Forces, which of course uses a high volume of transport fuels for whether it's for shipping and bunker fuels, whether it's for AV gas as a critical ingredient for things like the Air Force, and of course traditional fuels, whether it's petrochemicals, diesel and the like, as part of fueling things like tanks and other vehicles. So fuel security matters, not just for our economy, but for our national security. And hedging that risk is going to be critically important for the future. But that, of course, requires a long supply chain. We have a supply chain where, of course, we have domestic reservations and domestic supply. We import a large part of our fuels, particularly from Singapore, but people are increasingly concerned, well, what happens in an environment with those trade avenues are blocked off, and it needn't be through conflict. It can simply be through some sort of blockade, and will that cut the country off from the rest of the world? And one of the great strengths of our country on many, many levels is, of course, our geographic location means that we can hedge that risk by importing fuels from just about anywhere else on the planet, because there are so many different avenues for shipping routes. They're not all desirable. No one's arguing they're all desirable. But in the case of crisis, we have options. Many other countries do not. In fact, just as a completely outside comment, a couple of years ago, Deputy Speaker, I went to Armenia, a landlocked country that essentially has 3 out of its 4 borders closed. It does not have the same luxury or options we do in terms of its geography and its capacity to be able to access open markets. So we have options directly from the Middle East, directly from Singapore, directly from South America, directly from the United States, which is one of the reasons why at the start of last year the government took an option to buy some fuel reserve in the United States, because it gave us more options. But it's not just about having access to the fuel, it's about also having access, of course, to the shipping of it, but then more critically what we need to do in terms of refining so that we can provide domestically resources to the Australian economy and to our national security. And that's what this bill's about. This bill is about completing the supply chain so that if you're in the refining business, that you have an incentive to continue to operate in Australia against a backdrop where we've seen a number of refineries close, and maintaining we conserve that domestic capacity so that we can provide that degree of security for our country. Because, as I said, it has a big impact in terms of our defence, but it also has a big impact in terms of other sectors like agriculture, transport and mining, which are the foundations of the Australian economy and the foundation of the wealth that leads to the employment of Australians, the compounding in terms of other sectors like manufacturing and a service-based economy, and ultimately provides the wealth in which we all enjoy so that we can have a wealthy and prosperous country and provide the health and education services and the like, and the essential services that Australians need. And so the objective of this bill is to lock in commitments from refineries so that they have clear incentives to operate, and that if there is an environment where there's a shortfall, that of course they get the incentive they need to continue to operate as a backstop, as part of a safeguard for the interests of the nation. I've had some constituents write to me and say, I don't agree with what the government's doing here because they're concerned about environmental factors, and I do understand that. But the reality is the primary basis in which we're doing this is for the security of the nation as a backstop. And of course we have to make trade-off decisions and serious decisions in this parliament about the long-term interests of the nation, and that is what this bill does. And it's quite clear what the impact will be. We'll stop the closure of remaining refineries that operate in Australia for the next 5 years. It will result in 1,250 direct jobs not being lost, and a further 1,700 or thereabouts jobs being lost in the construction sector. And of course a negative impact through higher prices in all fuel-dependent industries. And just about every industry has a fuel at the heart of its competitiveness, and it's always been one of the foundations of what's made this country economically strong. Not just that we've got extractive industries and agriculture and primary industries that create the wealth, but we've also had a competitive energy market that's enabled the realisation of that wealth. You remove the competitive energy or even the accessibility of energy, and you will undermine the very core of the Australian economy. And of course, when it comes to bigger discussions around stocks, it of course underpins that sense of security and confidence for the country. And the way it's doing is by providing payments directly to companies should they end up in a situation where they drop below a certain threshold, and particularly below a certain threshold in terms of competitive price. And it's quite clear what many of the interests in this space think, because they're aware of the risks that come if we don't implement this policy, but more to the point, what it does for the confidence of the economy if we're to back it in. And I'd hope the members opposite, despite their virtue signalling— sorry, it's not even virtue signalling, Deputy Speaker. Virtue signalling implies that there's some sense of virtue. This is just sort of partisan signalling, a sort of an amendment to whip up the troops, as it were, to get them excited as they watch their leader fail and flail as a consequence of their lack of vision for this country, their absence of any idea about what they want to progress, and of course no other issues they want to put on the table, unless they'd like to revisit the previous elections agenda, and we can debate that out as much as you wish. I'm quite happy to debate that, and we had the member for McMahon there before complaining about Labor's last election defeat. He was, of course, the architect and the author. And we see other members like the member for Gellibrand over there who are doing an outstanding job ensuring that members of the coalition are re-elected, and we wish them all the best in their continued success. But we're actually going to get on with governing for the interests of Australia. And that is the basis of this legislation, and we just hope that they might at some point put down their partisan weapons and actually decide to be positive contributors. Now, in this debate so far, that has not been the case. We hope that might change, but we know from the lessons of history, if you want to look at future behaviour, the best indicator is past behaviour, and we know that's less likely to occur. But that's okay. That's their issue, and the Australian people are ready to judge you very, very harshly, opposition members, at the next election, and we look forward to it. Because you just need to look at what, and let's face it, Deputy Speaker, they're not normally friends of mine. They're not normally fans of mine or of this government. In fact, they're normally fans of the former leader of the opposition and the member for Maribyrnong, but the Australian Workers' Union and what they're saying about what the Morrison government is doing. It must come as sort of a knife cut in the heart of the Australian Labor Party when the National Secretary, Dan Walton, of the Australian Workers' Union, has said of the Morrison government's fuel security bill and associated legislation that, quote, "we are extremely satisfied," because they know what's on the line: their workers, their jobs, their members, and of course the health and security of our country. He went on to say, quote, "the security of the production payment provision, along with the investment to make cleaner fuel, will underpin longevity for both refineries, and today's announcement will save thousands of jobs both directly to refineries and indirectly through jobs supported in the community." And that's one of the things that has been lost by members of the opposition on this bill. It's not just that we're locking in arrangements to ensure that we guarantee the security and supply for the Australian economy of certain fuels through refining, but we've also increased the obligations and standards that come with it. So you're actually going to have cheaper, better, more environmentally sustainable and less particulate fuel supplies in this country. It's literally security and environmental responsibility in one. This is what we do as a government. That is not what they do as an opposition. But let's get beyond just the naked vested interests of the Workers' Union, and let's go and look at some of the other sectors that have voiced their similar support. The Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries, who again, their interest is principally in making sure that we have an environment that's sympathetic and supportive to motorists. Quote, "Australian motorists and the environment will be beneficiaries of the federal government's plan to support the operations of fuel refineries in Geelong and Brisbane." And they said it was, quote, "a significant and positive step." Well, good on them. They're right. Let's go to the Australian Trucking Association. Again, there are many people who work in the trucking industry, and they're a critical part of making sure we have the supply chains to make sure that when you go to the supermarket, you can get some milk, or you can go get some apples, or you can get fresh food so that the next generation can stay young and healthy. And what have they said? They have said that, quote, "diesel and liquid fuel security are critical to Australia's economy. 98% of the energy for the transport sector is sourced from liquid fuel." And, quote, "this is a big win for every road user." Correct, Deputy Speaker, because if there are higher costs, what happens is they flow through to the prices you pay, Australians pay, when they go to the supermarket or when they go to purchase goods and services. And of course the Australian Automobile Association, who says that, quote, "the government is right to be focused on Australia's need to comply with our International Energy Agency obligations, is right to be helping fund construction of an expanded network of fuel storage depots around Australia," because that's what this bill also does. So at every point, this government is delivering security of our national energy supply, competitiveness in our national energy supply, making sure that we back the industries that need support right now, particularly, frankly, in the great state of Victoria, as part of a plan to rebuild Australia's future.
The question is,